If you remember when the last ban list happened, I did two videos that were very similar. One of them was the 5 winners from that particular ban list, and the other one was the 5 losers from that particular ban list. In those videos, I talked about decks like Sky Strikers and Altergeist and Thunder Dragons that I felt were really good going forward, and I ended up being correct. Those decks were the top decks of this past format, and likely will be the top decks going forward because Sky Strikers and Altergeist received no hits, and Thunder Dragons got a light slap on the wrist. In today's video, I'm not going to focus on the top 5 meta decks out of this new format. I'm not claiming to have solved the format overnight, but I want to focus on 5 rogue decks that are winners from this recent ban list. A lot of cards got banned, a lot of cards came off this list, and as such, I think that there are a lot of direct and indirect decks that got support from this recent ban list. In today's video, I want to talk about 5 of those rogue strategies that I feel are good choices going forward. If you're one of the players that has these sort of sitting around, maybe now is the best possible time to play these at YCS Chicago in side events or possibly at a regional qualifier. First up though, I want to give an honorable mention to any deck that can play El Shaddoll Construct. I don't actually think that one construct is enough to make Shaddolls come back as a strategy, but certain decks, especially the ones that are playing light monsters, might want to tech in a few copies of Shaddoll Fusion, especially in games 2 and 3 when they're going second. I couldn't really come up with a ton of great strategies that were doing this, and it's not really an entire strategy to base a deck around, but it's still worth honorable mentioning because I think Construct, while it might not be as good as it used to be, it certainly is good in tandem with Shaddoll Fusion in a deck that's playing a lot of light monsters. It's a big monster that can destroy opponents' monsters pretty easily and also sets up your graveyard in the process, and as Brilliant Fusion is now limited, which means it's basically unplayable, there are less ways to get light monsters in the graveyard easily, so Shaddoll Fusion and El Shaddoll Construct might see play in a few fringe strategies. Anyway though, the number 5 deck of the rogue winners on this particular ban list is True Dracos. True Dracos have sort of fallen off the map in the last month or two, but prior to that they were a pretty solid rogue contender and lots of people still play them to this day even if they're not topping as much. True Dracos got a huge boost from this list, not only because decks like Dark Warrior and Goki are now less so in the metagame. I'm sure someone will find some combo to break that deck, but in general you're at least keeping your hand, you're not getting Gumblard, and that makes decks like True Dracos that weren't so good going second against combo decks a little bit better. But more importantly, True Dracos now have access to 3 Monarch Stormforth. Many of the current True Draco lists are currently playing Monarchs Erupts. They don't even play an extra deck in the first place, and Monarch Stormforth can be an excellent form of spot removal that most decks can't take advantage of. I don't actually think that Monarch Stormforth will make the Monarch strategy any better than it currently is because Pantheism and Ether are still hit on the ban list, but in general I think that True Dracos can definitely take advantage of triple Stormforth, and I think that they will be a very common rogue strategy going forward. You might not see them all over tournaments, but I think that there will be more True Draco players now than there were last format. For many of the same reasons that I thought that True Dracos are going to be good in this next format, I think Frog Paleozoics might actually be better off than True Dracos. Frog Paleozoics have recently topped some YCSs and gotten some regional tops as well, and they've always been a pretty solid rogue strategy. The main selling point of a frog deck is Totally Awesome, which is still one of the best Xyz monsters in the game, and it's crazy to think that is just in a rogue strategy. So obviously Totally Awesome is very good and you want to play that in a Frog Paleozoic deck, but what makes Frog Paleozoic so good right now is the same thing that makes True Dracos good, and that it doesn't really have to go second so much against those combo decks anymore. Once again, maybe there is a big combo deck that I'm not really thinking of, and Thunder Dragons kind of fall under that category, but for the most part a frog player can actually play going second as long as they have cards in their hand without Gumblar in the game, because with going second with the Paleozoic cards you can usually dismantle boards one by one, and that actually is pretty good. More importantly though, Frog Paleozoics can play one of the best floodgates in the game right now, which is Goes and Match, a card that is extremely powerful against Sky Strikers and Altergeist, not to mention that most decks actually can't play Goes and Match in the first place because most decks in the metagame right now play different attributes. This of course makes Goes and Match even better against the top strategies, not to mention that your Totally Awesome can protect it while it's face up on the field. Overall, I think that frogs are an excellent choice going forward, and I expect to see many of them at tournaments. There is a pretty dedicated frog player community, and I think they are probably very happy with the current ban list that just came out. There are a few reasons why I think that Crusadia is looking like a solid rogue deck going forward. Admittedly, I do not play Crusadia. I don't know a ton about the deck, but I did talk to some people that do play this strategy, and I looked at some of the top decks that were able to top regionals, and I think that Crusadia are looking good for a few reasons. The first reason is that Interrupted Kaiju Slumber is now unlimited, and from pretty much all the lists of Crusadias that I could find at least, they all play Kaiju monsters, and many of them were playing Interrupted Kaiju Slumber as well, so that would definitely boost the strategy. And also, just like in the case of True Dracos and Frog Paleozoics, it's a deck that can go second, and in the case of Crusadias, I think at least the way that people are currently playing it, they want to go second, and that really helps when you're not having to go against decks like Gumblar for 6, and you can actually break your opponent's board and OTK them. Also, Crusadia is receiving a ton of support indirectly, I believe, in Savage Strike, and that makes a big deal for people that are trying to play that deck going forward. Crusadia is looking pretty good because of all these reasons, and it's also a fairly decent budget strategy for a lot of players. If you didn't play during 2015 Nekroz format, you might not understand why Shrit coming back to just limited is a huge deal for Nekroz, but nevertheless, I'm putting it almost at the top of my list because I think that Nekroz is going to be an excellent rogue deck going forward. Not only is Shrit no longer forbidden, but also Brionic is completely off the ban list, and even though Nekroz of Unicorn is still on the ban list, I think that Nekroz is looking good going forward. They have some new tools at their disposal. Preparation of Rites is back at 3, and that was only at 3 for a very short period of time when Nekroz were big, and also now you have access to the incantations that might be able to fill out some of the holes in the older Nekroz strategies. However, it is worth mentioning that many of the cards that hard counter Nekroz simply didn't exist when that deck was big. Things like Ash Blossom and Ghost Bell are excellent hand traps against the strategy. Infinite Impermanence is a really good counter to many of the cards as well, but possibly most importantly, Dimensional Barrier did not exist when Nekroz were big, and if it did, it probably would have been a hard counter for them, and Nekroz would not have been nearly as dominant as they were in 2015. I don't necessarily think that Nekroz are going to be a meta deck, and the reason that I don't think they're going to become a meta deck is because if they ever got to the point where they were a top deck again, everyone would just be playing Dimensional Barrier in their side deck, and then they would no longer be able to be that successful. However, just because a deck is not a top deck does not mean it's not a good deck, and in this case, I think that Nekroz is an excellent rogue contender, especially at YCS Chicago, because plenty of people just don't know what the Nekroz cards do. Obviously, Nekroz Atrishula is still the big heavy hitter of the deck, but plenty of the other cards have excellent on-field effects as well. Unicorn, Brionic, and Colossus all have really good effects that work really well against extra deck monsters, especially Link monsters. I think that means that Nekroz could be a pretty strong contender going forward, but possibly most importantly, the thing about Nekroz I think is so cool is that many players just don't know what the cards do anymore. A lot of people were not playing back in 2015. I'm sure plenty of people that are watching this video were not playing back then. I think that makes it a huge sleeper pick for YCS Chicago. I'm pretty sure that if enough people play Nekroz at YCS Chicago with good lists, they will actually get a few tops in the top 32. That's a pretty big deal for a deck from back from 2015, but I really do think that Shrit coming to 1 makes a huge difference to the deck, as well as in combination with the incantations and 3 Preparation of Rites. And lastly, what I think is the #1 rogue winner from this particular ban list, Kozmos. Kozmos have already gotten a few tops with Dark Destroyer at 3 copies, and that definitely makes them a pretty deadly deck, but the reason that I think this deck is a little bit better off after this current ban list is because limiter removal is at 3 copies per deck, which we've never really seen in Kozmos. People didn't really play limiter removal when it's at 1 copy. They experimented with it a little bit, but I think nowadays the fact that 3 copies of the card exist, I think that just opens up so much OTK potential that simply was not there before. One of the biggest issues with Kozmos in 2019 is that if you Dark Destroyer your own Dark Destroyer to get the graveyard effect of Summon Farm Girl, your opponent can just Ash Blossom the Dark Destroyer in the graveyard, and that pretty much stops your entire turn. However, if you use a card like Limiter Removal while you just have a couple Cosmos spaceships on the board, you are doing ridiculous amounts of damage to your opponent with untargetable ships that also float if your opponent manages to stop them in some way, and I think that is actually good enough to be a good rogue contender, especially at regional qualifiers where people are unprepared for it. Whenever you're thinking of running a rogue deck, the main reason to play a rogue deck is that you are trading something that the meta has. Maybe your deck is a little less consistent, maybe your deck's a little less powerful, and in return you are getting the surprise factor. And I think in the case of Nekroz and Kozmos, more so than the other decks in this video, they have the surprise factor behind them. When your opponent does not know which cards to play around because they don't know what your archetype actually does, that is a ridiculous advantage to have on them, especially when you're looking at decks that previously were very powerful meta strategies. Maybe they're not as good in 2019, maybe there's too many hand traps running around, maybe they're not as consistent, maybe they don't have all their cards, but even with all those things considered, I still think that Kozmos, I mean, they have already been proving themselves at regionals, and Nekroz, I think with Shrit and 3 Brio, actually have a huge chance at certain events because people just don't know what the cards do. That is a huge advantage whenever you're playing a rogue strategy, but especially in the case of Nekroz and Kozmos. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on all of these 5 rogue winners from this particular ban list. I think that the YCS Chicago format is fantastic. It reminds me a lot of Hat format, and that is a good thing because Hat format is such a fantastic format in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. It seems like there's so many viable decks and there aren't that many crazy combo decks that are extra linking you or taking all the cards out of your hand, and I really like that back and forth Yu-Gi-Oh that I remember from 2014, 2015, and 2016, but didn't really see a lot of in 2017 or 2018. I think if Yu-Gi-Oh is going back to its roots, maybe not everyone will see it that way, but at least as someone that has been playing at a lot of events this past couple years, it seems like this is one of the most back and forth formats that we've seen in a while. I'll see you guys later though. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any other rogue winners from this January ban list. I'll see you later though. Bye.